thevoicebeforethevoid.net. Trapped by a War Party. From The Wilderness Hunter by Theodore Roosevelt. Read by The Voice Before the Void. Accidents are common. Men break their collarbones, arms, or legs by falling when riding at speed over dangerous ground, when cutting cattle or trying to control a stampeded herd, or by being thrown or rolled on by bucking or rearing horses. Or their horses, and on rare occasion even they themselves, are gored by fighting steers. Death by storm or in flood, death in striving to master a wild and vicious horse, or in handling maddened cattle, and too often death in brutal conflict with one of his own fellows. Any one of these is the not unnatural end of the life of the dweller on the plains or in the mountains. But a few years ago, other risks had to be run from savage beasts and from the Indians. Since I have been ranching on the Little Missouri, 2 men have been killed by bears in the neighborhood of my range. And in the early years of my residence there, several men living or traveling in the country were slain by small war parties of young braves. All the old-time trappers and hunters could tell stirring tales of their encounters with Indians. My friend, Tazewell Woody, was among the chief actors in one of the most noteworthy adventures of this land. He was a very quiet man, and it was exceedingly difficult to get him to talk over any of his past experiences. But one day, when he was in high good humor with me for having made 3 consecutive straight shots at elk, he became quite communicative, and I was able to get him to tell me one story which I had long wished to hear from his lips, having already heard of it through one of the other survivors of the incident. When he found that I already knew a good deal, old Woody told me the rest. It was the spring of 1875, and Woody and 2 friends were trapping on the Yellowstone. The Sioux were very bad at the time, and had killed many prospectors, hunters, cowboys, and settlers. The whites retaliated whenever they got a chance, but, as always in Indian warfare, the sly, lurking, bloodthirsty savages inflicted much more loss than they suffered. The 3 men, having a dozen horses with them, were camped by the riverside in a triangular patch of brush, shaped a good deal like a common flat iron. On reaching camp, they started to put out their traps, and when he came back in the evening, Woody informed his companions that he had seen a great deal of Indian sign, and he believed that there were Sioux in the neighborhood. His companions both laughed at him, assuring him that they were not Sioux at all, but friendly Crows, and that they would be in camp next morning. And sure enough, said Woody meditatively, they were in camp next morning. By dawn, one of the men went down to the river to look at some of the traps, while Woody started out to where the horses were, the 3rd man remaining in camp to get breakfast. Suddenly 2 shots were heard down by the river, and in another moment a mounted Indian swept towards the horses. Woody fired but missed him, and he drove off 5 while Woody, running forward, succeeded in herding the other 7 into camp. Hardly had this been accomplished before the man who had gone down the river appeared, out of breath with his desperate run, having been surprised by several Indians, and just succeeding in making his escape by dodging from bush to bush, threatening his pursuers with his rifle. These proved to be but the forerunners of a great war party, for when the sun rose, the hills around them seemed black with Sioux. Had they chosen to dash right in on the camp, running the risk of losing several of their men in the charge, they could of course have eaten up the 3 hunters in a minute. But such a charge is rarely practiced by Indians, although they are admirable in defensive warfare, and even in certain kinds of offensive movements, and although from their skill in hiding they usually inflict much more loss than they suffer when matched against white troops, are yet very reluctant to make any movement where the advantage gained must be offset by considerable loss of life. The 3 men thought they were surely doomed, but being veteran frontiersmen and long inured to every kind of hardship and danger, they set to work with cool resolution to make as effective a defense as possible, to beat off their antagonists if they might, and if this proved impracticable, to sell their lives as dearly as they could. Having tethered the horses in a slight hollow, the only one which offered any protection, each man crept out to a point of the triangular brush patch and lay down to await events. In a very short while, the Indians began closing in on them, taking every advantage of cover. And then, both from their side of the river and from the opposite bank, opened a perfect fusillade, wasting their cartridges with a recklessness which Indians are apt to show when excited. The hunters could hear the hoarse commands of the chiefs, the war whoops and the taunts in broken English which some of the warriors hurled at them. Very soon all of their horses were killed, and the brush was fairly riddled by the incessant volleys. But the 3 men themselves, lying flat on the ground and well concealed, were not harmed. The more daring young warriors then began to creep toward the hunters, going stealthily from one piece of cover to the next. and now the whites in turn opened fire. They did not shoot recklessly as did their foes, but coolly and quietly, endeavoring to make each shot tell. Said Woody, "I only fired 7 times all day. I reckoned on getting meat every time I pulled trigger." They had an immense advantage over their enemies, in that whereas they lay still and entirely concealed, the Indians, of course, had to move from cover to cover in order to approach, and so had at times to expose themselves. When the whites fired at all, they fired at a man, whether moving or motionless, whom they could clearly see, while the Indians could only shoot at the smoke, which imperfectly marked the position of their unseen foes. In consequence, the assailants speedily found that it was a task of hopeless danger to try in such a manner to close in on 3 Plains veterans, men of iron nerve and skilled in the use of the rifle. Yet some of the more daring crept up very close to the patch of brush, and one actually got inside it, and was killed among the bedding that lay by the smoldering campfire. The wounded and such of the dead as did not lie in too exposed positions were promptly taken away by their comrades, but 7 bodies fell into the hands of the 3 hunters. I asked Woody how many he himself had killed. He said he could only be sure of 2 that he got. One he shot in the head as he peeped over a bush, and the other he shot through the smoke as he attempted to rush in. "My, how that Indian did yell," said Woody retrospectively. "He was no great of a stoic." After 2 or 3 hours of this deadly skirmishing, which resulted in nothing more serious to the whites than in 2 of them being slightly wounded, the Sioux became disheartened by the loss they were suffering and withdrew, confining themselves thereafter to a long-range and harmless fusillade. When it was dark, the 3 men crept out to the riverbed, and, taking advantage of the pitchy night, broke through the circle of their foes. They managed to reach the settlements without further molestation, having lost everything except their rifles.